So Apple Silicon is finally here. We've got the new Apple M1 chip and we've got 3 new Macs to show it off. Let's talk about it. So I have to say there weren't any huge surprises from the event for me and for regular viewers of the channel either. We've been pretty accurately predicting what's going to happen with Apple Silicon. Really, it's quite logical if you understand what Apple was trying to achieve with this stuff in the first place. Of course, there's been a huge amount of Apple Silicon content, both on YouTube and in the blogosphere, and quite a bit of misinformation and misunderstanding about it as well. But now we've got all of the facts, let's run through the event. Now, I'm presenting this video, the event only finished about an hour ago, and I'm just going to do it off the cuff from my notes here, and I hope that's okay. Nothing scripted today. Tim Cook kicked things off just sort of reviewing all of the new releases and the hardware that's been brought out this year by Apple, and software as well, of course. He did point out that Mac sales grew by 30% in the last quarter. I don't know which quarter particularly he was referring to, but I think that's really interesting, that the Mac sales should grow at a time right after Apple had announced the migration to Apple Silicon. So could this be people rushing out to buy Intel Macs because they're concerned that they're going to disappear? Could be. And then they got straight into it. They talked about how they've spent some years developing a family of chips that they're going to be using, and several years working specifically on silicon for the Mac as well. I assume that's both hardware and software. And they announced the M1 chip. Now, to be clear, the M1 is different from the iPad chips. We did say actually in our podcast this week that we expected Apple to use a different naming scheme for the Mac-specific chips, and we did actually suggest that we might have an M chip, so quite gratifying to see that we were right on that. The first thing they spoke about was unified memory architecture, and I haven't had the time to do any in-depth research on this, but this seems to be soldered on RAM, of course, that's very close to the system on chip, and this means that the system on chip can grant very fast access to memory, and it can manipulate that either to the CPU or to the GPU. That's going to make the chip very fast. It's on the 5 nanometer process, so this is at TSMC, the foundry that makes all of Apple's stuff. 5 nanometers is very small. They're measuring transistors at the atomic scale by this point. And he spoke about there being 16 billion transistors in the system on chip. And that doesn't sound too dissimilar to what they said about the A14 Bionic, which, of course, is what this chip is based on. But it's not identical to it. It's got 8 CPU cores for starters, and these break down as 4 high-performance cores and 4 high-efficiency cores. So this is something that's fairly common with the ARM architecture. Now, just to be clear, I've said this before, but Apple doesn't use standard reference ARM designs. It's their own design using the ARM instruction set. So the idea with the big little principle in ARM is that you have high power cores that are very powerful but use a lot of power, and you have efficiency cores which are not as powerful but don't use as much power. And the system then balances the load between the two. Now, the new version of macOS, Big Sur, is going to be particularly clever at doing that. And it will also allow developers to specify whether a process is of high importance or whether it should be run in the background. So we should see apps that are very well optimized for the M1 chip and will run very quickly. Now, what they said about the high-performance cores is that they're some of the fastest high-performance cores in the world. And we've looked at the benchmarks, we've looked at the real-world performance on the only silicon from Apple that we were able to look at up to this point, which is the iPad chips. And this is a totally believable claim. Possibly not so much with the latest Ryzen 5000 series. I've noticed the single-core performance on those is very quick and faster than the A14. But yeah, these chips are very quick. And he's talking about high efficiency as well, and that they can use basically 1/10 of the power of the high performance cores. And these high efficiency cores will be used for low priority system tasks that don't need top end performance. And that actually covers quite a lot of your day-to-day computing. So rather than use up your battery life on these non-important tasks, the system will instead direct them to these high-efficiency cores, which gives you a longer battery life. They're also claiming as well that they've got now the best CPU performance per watt. And they showed some slides where they said it's got 2 times the performance of the fastest PC chip in their laptops. They didn't specify which chip this is. I find this incredibly frustrating about Apple's claims. You've got to take it all with a pinch of salt until we can properly test this. But they are saying that 2 times the performance at 10 watts, and then it can match the performance of that PC chip at maximum performance using just a quarter of the power. If that is the case, that's very impressive indeed. So Apple then spoke about the GPU, which has got 8 cores. And again, they're praising the power efficiency of this. They say it's the most advanced GPU they've ever made. And again, they're making this claim about the PC chip, where it offers 2 times the performance at 10 watts. And then it matches the top performance of that PC chip at 1/3 of the power. So I assume that the PC chip they're talking about is the latest Intel 10th generation with the Iris Plus graphics. And we already know that the A14 Bionic outperforms that chip, as does, in fact, the A12Z and the A12X chips. And it's important to remember that this is not just a CPU or a GPU, it's a system on chip. So you've also got the neural engine. So there are 16 cores devoted to that, and it can cater for 11 trillion operations per second. So for machine learning purposes, this is going to be a very good chip. How does this compare to the A14 Bionic? You know, lots of people who don't really understand what Apple was doing with their silicon were of the opinion that the Mac silicon is just an iPad chip in a Mac body. That's not the case. So this CPU, of course, has 8 cores, whereas the A14 Bionic has 6 cores. But remember, there are high power cores and high efficiency cores. The A14 Bionic has 2 of the power cores and 4 of the efficiency cores. So we're actually getting in this CPU 2 additional high performance cores. So that's a good start. The GPU that's in the A14 Bionic is 4 cores, and now we're getting 8 cores in the M1. So yes, the M1 chip is based on the underpinnings of the A14 Bionic, but there's more to it, there's more under the hood, and we should expect more performance. And that's pretty astonishing given how fast that A14 Bionic chip already is. John Turnus was then speaking about the tight integration between hardware and software. And this is a point that we've been trying to make over the last few months since this transition was announced. When you control both the hardware and the software, it's possible to create a truly optimized experience. So you can give the user the best possible experience. You can give the best possible performance as well. Apple have a real advantage in this area over, say, Microsoft Windows. Now, that's not to take anything away from Windows. Frankly, the number of possible permutations of PC hardware that Windows has to support is mind-boggling. The fact that it runs at all is incredible. And it doesn't just run, does it? Windows 10 is a fantastic operating system. But Microsoft aren't in control of that software and hardware in the same way that Apple is, and they're able to take things on a step further now. We next had Craig Federighi then talking about how that optimization works in the real world. So he mentioned how launching apps is nearly instant, and they demonstrated that. Obviously, that's something I'd like to test for myself. He spoke about Safari running 1.5 times faster with JavaScript and being twice as good as the previous version. Again, there's no sort of hard data to back that up. It's just an Apple claim at the moment. This unified memory architecture, again, he came back to that, and he spoke about how it eliminates the need for expensive, in computing terms, expensive copying of data and translation of data between the different memories on the system. I guess he's referring to the likes of moving data from the system RAM to the GPU RAM, for example, which traditionally in a PC would be copied over the PCI Express bus. With a system on chip, you don't have that kind of overhead. Now, that's not to say that a system on chip is going to outperform the latest dedicated graphics cards in a PC. I'm sure it isn't going to do that. But it is an interesting solution for the future, and I'm keen to see where Apple can take it. What this means is the system is able to provide the GPU with more access to the memory than it was ever before possible. And they showed a demonstration of color grading with 6K footage, and again, it did look very smooth. They spoke about quiet performance and better battery life, and they also mentioned better security as well. And particularly, I noted they said hardware verified secure boot. And I suspect this is not great news for the repair and reuse movement. You may have seen the videos with the new iPhone 12, and Hugh Jeffreys did a great video where he took two identical iPhone 12s and tried to swap the camera module from one to the other, and it bricks the phone. It won't boot up with the foreign camera module in it. So it seems like all of the hardware is going to be tied together. Apple's been going this way for a long time. I don't personally like that. I'm sure a lot of you guys out there don't like it either, but it is what it is. So we won't get into that here. So next they went on to talk about apps, and he did say that all of the apps that Apple make have been optimized for the M1 system on chip. He specifically spoke about Final Cut Pro and said it would be up to 6 times faster. But again, 6 times faster than what? We don't know. I mean, was he referring to trying to run Final Cut Pro on a dual-core MacBook Air? No idea. We'll find out, of course, when we get to test the machines for real. He spoke about then universal apps, and this is something that Apple referred to way back at WWDC in June, where the apps would be delivered with both an x86 binary for Intel Macs and also an Apple Silicon binary for Apple Silicon Macs. And these apps will basically just run on either machine. So whether you've got an Intel Mac or an Apple Silicon Mac, it won't matter. If your software developer is delivering you a universal binary, whichever machine you're using, you're going to get a great optimized experience. But what about if the developer hasn't made an Apple Silicon binary or a universal binary for their app? Well, we don't need to worry about that because of Rosetta. So Rosetta is a technology that runs either when you install the app or it will run when you first run the app. And what it does is it translates that x86 code into Apple Silicon code. So if your app runs on macOS Big Sur, then your Apple Silicon Mac will run it. Now, it could be that the developer needs to do more optimization. We spoke earlier about how you might optimize your app to make use of those different cores. If the developer hasn't done that, then the system itself will need to guess which is the best priority to assign to things. So my expectation is that there'll always be a little bit of performance left on the table if the developer doesn't specifically optimize their app for Apple Silicon. Now, back at that June event, WWDC, Apple did say that they'd been working with Adobe and Microsoft to get their apps onto the platform, but it seems like they've backtracked a little bit from this. Adobe are having Lightroom available from next month and Photoshop next year. No mention of the rest of the Creative Suite. And I expect that that's going to sound an alarm bell for many creative professionals out there who rely on Adobe's tools. So obviously, you're going to be very keen to see how those things run under Rosetta. One thing he did say, and I have seen this demoed actually in the developer documentation, is that some graphic-intensive apps run better on Rosetta than they do natively on an Intel Mac. And that's because of the raw horsepower of that system on chip, but it's also because of the way the Metal framework is optimized. And again, we come back to that hardware and software optimization that Apple can do. Now, of course, developers can optimize code across all platforms because iOS and iPadOS apps will run now on macOS. Again, many people have spoken out against this. They feel that that somehow cheapens the macOS system, or that Apple's trying to push towards a closed app ecosystem like iPadOS and iOS, where you've got to get all of your apps from the App Store. That's not actually what Apple is doing. I don't dispute for a moment that Apple would love to do that in the long term, but that's probably a little bit down the line yet. Obviously, we've still got Intel support for many years yet in the Mac OS. And I don't think it's such a bad thing either, because it means that developers who have developed apps on iPadOS or iOS can very easily migrate their apps over to macOS, because the heavy lifting of the code has already been done. So it's mainly user interface changes. And the same thing is true in reverse. And I was talking to my wife about this earlier, and she was talking about the difference between using Microsoft Word on her iPad and on her MacBook Air. Well, those differences should be a thing of the past in due time, because it will be possible to use the same code base on both systems. So it'll just be a case of refining that user interface for the appropriate machine that you're using and the appropriate user interface experience. There were some testimonials from various different app development companies. Panic was one of them. I used to use Panic's software actually used to use Coda and Transmit. Very good company, been making Mac software for a long time. Cinema 4D, Adobe, Omni Group, Serif, and they particularly were speaking about one of their apps. I think might have been the publisher or the designer app, but they said it only took them a day to get the app ready. All of these developers, in fact, were saying it was very quick to transition their apps and that now their apps are running faster and smoother. Lots of people are very concerned that this creates a huge amount of work for developers, but I've been through the developer documentation and I've looked at the way Xcode does this. So if a developer is producing their app within Xcode, then it does make it very easy to transition that code across to Apple Silicon. Xcode does all of the hard work, and that frees up the developers to focus on the optimization of their app. Where this isn't going to be so great, of course, is where a developer is not using Xcode to develop their app. And there are some fairly heavyweight professional applications where that will be the case. And so for those developers, yes, this is a big change and a fairly significant amount of work. But if a developer is already using the Xcode tools and the developer kit, then it should be a fairly easy transition. So then we get to the actual computers. 3 new Macs. Of course, they're not really new. They don't look new. We've got a MacBook Air, a MacBook Pro 13-inch with the 2 ports, and a Mac Mini. So we are very much expecting a new MacBook Air or a fanless design that was focused on battery performance, and that is exactly what we've got. But compared to the existing 13-inch MacBook, they're saying that this new one is up to 3.5 times faster than the previous generation, with up to 5 times faster graphics performance. They're saying that you can edit multiple streams of 4K ProRes footage without any issues. I mean, I've never heard of anyone really doing any serious video editing on a MacBook Air, but that sounds pretty impressive. And I think for consumers, who have their iPhone recording video or maybe a GoPro or stuff like this, they're going to really love that. Being able to edit video on a MacBook Air, that's quite something. They're saying that it's 3 times faster than the best-selling Windows equivalent. So that's an equivalent priced Windows laptop in the same segment. And they also said it's faster than 98% of PC laptops sold last year. But I think that's probably a fairly meaningless statistic because I suspect most of those are very cheap laptops. The SSD is 2 times faster. And of course, the system is fanless. Now, we'll come back to this in a little bit, but I suspect that means that the performance is somewhat limited. But we'll see. The battery life, we've got 15 hours of wireless web browsing, 18 hours of video watching, and they said something a bit odd. It's 6 hours longer at video conferencing, whatever that means. Now, something that's in this M1 chip is the image signal processor, and this means that they tying in the machine learning on the chip to do more enhanced face detection, to do denoising of the image and basically give you a better quality image for video conferencing. And, Apple's webcams are not the best in the world, but they're not the worst either. So still, some better quality that will be appreciated, particularly in the current climate. The display is a 13-inch Retina display that now supports P3 wide color. You've got Touch ID just like currently, and then you've got 2 USB-C type ports on the side, which are Thunderbolt or USB 4. So that's really nice to see. A headphone jack on the right-hand side. You can spec it with either 8 or 16 gigs of RAM, and you can go up to 2 terabytes of storage. We'll get into more pricing detail when we do the podcast episode, but they're saying it still starts at $1,000, $999. They next went on to talk about the Mac Mini. Now, we did wonder whether there might be a Mac Mini coming out. I actually thought possibly not this time. So this is one area where I'm pleased to be proved wrong. I was quite happy to see this. They're saying up to 3 times faster than the previous quad-core edition with 6 times faster graphics. And again, trying to compare to the equivalent PC in the same price bracket and same sector, and they're saying it's 5 times faster and 1/10 of the size. So maybe it is, maybe it isn't. 15 times faster machine learning performance will mean something to scientists who are working in that field. There's quite a big fan inside this Mac Mini, and that means sustained performance. And this is something they went out of their way to say. And so by extension, we come back to the fanless MacBook Air, we suspect that won't have sustained performance. So the Mac Mini should be a little powerhouse, actually. Again, you've got a couple of Thunderbolt/USB 4 ports. It will drive the Pro XDR display, if you've got money to burn on that, at the full 6K resolution. So for the average person driving a HD or a 4K display, no issues whatsoever. It does have an HDMI port as well. You've got Wi-Fi 6, a couple of USB Type A's I noticed, and Ethernet, and it starts at $700, $699. I'm not going to do this 99 rubbish, can't stand it. It's $700. That's going to get you the 8GB model with 256 gig of storage. Obviously, as soon as you start adding RAM and storage, the price starts going up, unsurprisingly. We've got a MacBook Pro 13-inch with a touch bar. Only 2 USB-C type ports that I can see on it. Again, they're Thunderbolt/USB 4. They're saying 2.8 times faster performance, but I don't know what they're actually comparing that to. 5 times faster GPU performance and 3 times faster than the best-selling Windows equivalent. Whether that's true or not, who knows? What they are saying, though, is that it can play back 8K ProRes in DaVinci Resolve without dropping a single frame. So I'm quite happy about that. I'm quite happy to see DaVinci Resolve mentioned because that's my video editor of choice. So looking forward to testing that out. 11 times faster machine learning performance. That doesn't mean that this chip is different, by the way, to the Mac Mini chip. They're identical chips across the range. The only difference between these is going to be the cooling system. The MacBook Pro 13-inch does have a fan in it, so it can sustain some performance, and it also gets amazing battery life. 17 hours of wireless web, 20 hours of video playback, and that's the longest battery life ever in a Mac. I think that's... I'm not sure I've seen a laptop with longer battery life than that. I'm sure someone will correct me in the comments if I'm wrong there. And starting from 1300. The big news is, of course, that you can order these things today. And I indeed have already ordered my Apple Silicon machine. But I'm not going to tell you what it is because that'll be another video. Big Sur comes out this week on Thursday, the 12th of November. And something they did say is that they've still got a couple of years left in this journey. Well, we've come from June all the way to November, and they said 2 years in June, and now they're saying 2 years in November. So it doesn't really surprise me. We said that it was going to take a little longer than 2 years. I think that was a little bit ambitious. But I'd like to just focus in, though, on something that Tim Cook said at the end, and I'm going to quote this exactly. He said, "Advancements of this magnitude only come from making bold changes." Well, I agree with that, and I think Apple have made bold changes. And I think they have the courage to do that because in a lot of cases, they don't really give too much of a toss about the customer. So they make these bold changes at the expense of us in a lot of cases. Perhaps that's being a little bit unfair, but I think anybody who's just been out and bought a MacBook Air, for example, in the last week or so, or a MacBook Pro 13-inch is probably going to feel a little bit aggrieved at the moment. And this is the price of progress. And you can bet your life next year we'll see the M2 chip and everything will be considerably better. I'm fairly certain that Apple will have held something back in reserve to bring out next year. I'm thinking maybe we might see some more machines in the springtime. And that would probably mean still an M1 chip, but perhaps an M1X or something like that, where they put in some extra cores or do something like that. I think when the M2 chip comes out, there's a possibility it could be on the new 3nm process that TSMC are working on. And if that is the case, then we'll again see a decent leap forward in performance. And maybe Apple is banking on that for its Pro machines to get that additional performance out. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, really. I'm excited about Apple Silicon. I think it represents a step change in computing. And again, I've said this before on the channel. I think it will be a new way of computing. And the real world performance of these machines is what we need to focus on. It's all very well going and running a CPU benchmark, which incidentally Apple Silicon does really well at, but that might not take into account machine learning, for example. And if you've got a machine learning application, you're probably better off with the M1 chip than you are with an Intel chip. If you want to go AAA gaming, then, well, you probably wouldn't have a Mac anyway, but you might be, you'll be thinking Intel chip. If you want to do virtual machines, you'll be thinking Intel. So what we really need to do is get some real-world tests done with these chips to see how they behave with actual applications, doing actual real work, and see where the performance benefits actually are. One of the final things that Tim Cook said is that these new Macs will run more software than ever. And I think this is absolutely true, and this is absolutely the point. So many people are really panicking about software support, but actually Apple are bringing out a platform that supports all of the existing Intel software and all of the iPad and iPhone software. And it creates new opportunities for developers who might have shied away from the platform before. I can think of at least 2 or 3 apps that I use on my iPad all the time that I'd like to have on my Mac. I think that's pretty great. You may think otherwise. Anyway, as soon as we get that new hardware and we're going to start testing it, we'll do our initial observations and some initial benchmarks, obvious stuff. We'll get to it fairly quickly. Then we'll try and test some of the more niche things. So if there's anything that you really want to see tested, please leave a comment below and we'll try to accommodate as much as we can. Obviously, time is limited. The channel is still small. The income that comes from the channel does not even come close to covering the cost of Apple Silicon or my time in producing videos for it. So if you feel up to supporting the channel, I'd really appreciate a click of that subscribe button. Please give me a thumbs up if you think I deserved it. Share the content with someone else who you think will like it. I hope to see you again for some more geekery.